and let's get straight to it. And welcome to the Modern Meltdown podcast. This is episode 23, Gun Control, America versus Australia. Very sadly, on February 14th, 2018, Nicholas Cruz opened fire on his former classmates at Stoneman Douglas High School, killing 17 people. Now, this tragic event has led me to think about one question a lot of people have been asking, and that's, can Australia's laws, specifically our gun control laws, be implemented in America? Well, the answer to that question is something that we're going to try and address on today's podcast. And what we're going to have to do is take a look at how both countries regulate their firearm possession. And then we will strive to maybe answer some of those questions for you. So why does Australia have such tight gun control laws? Now, this is a very easy one to answer. Now, our worst shooting massacre pretty much changed our gun laws forever in Australia. In 1996, Martin Bryant killed 35 people at Port Arthur in the Australian state of Tasmania. There was no registration requirement for gun ownership, aside from a handgun in Tasmania. And this enabled Bryant to easily buy the weapons that he purchased in order to get that massacre right up into the record books. It was one of the worst massacres in the world. And very sadly, America has beaten that record a couple of times over. Now, our Prime Minister at the time, John Howard, he made the decision to reform gun laws as a direct result of the mass shooting. John Howard crafted the National Firearms Program Implementation Act in 1996. This was used to restrict individuals' ability to own semi-automatic rifles and shotguns, as well as pump-action shotguns. Now, Prime Minister Howard's reforms also introduced firearm licensing. So that's all a lot to handle, and let's talk about how the laws have changed gun ownership in Australia. Now, first and foremost, guns must be registered. That means that any weapon that is in your possession is identified with you. That means serial number is attached to your personal information. If that gun's found, or if it's used in a crime, then they know immediately who is responsible for that weapon. Now, outright, automatic and semi-automatic weapons were banned. There is no leeway with this. They were absolutely completely banned. Now, more than 100,000 guns were destroyed in a buyback scheme. Now, gun owners must also have a valid reason for owning a weapon, including farming or hunting. Guns and ammunition must be locked and stored appropriately. Now, states must adhere to the Firearms Act of 1996 and the Weapons Prohibition Act of 1998. We also had a second gun amnesty which ran last year. That was between July 1st to September 30th, 2017, in which the Australian government collected another 26,000 guns for destruction. This was also very interesting. Some of the guns that were put into police possession included guns from all the way back in World War II that some families had been holding on to and decided to get those out of circulation. And so those guns were forfeited and they were destroyed. Now, to understand the difference between Australia and America, I'm going to throw a couple more stats at you. And this will sort of give you an idea of the differences between our two countries. I think it's important to talk about Australia and the US and to understand both countries in order to continue with the debate. So the Australian population, as it stands, is currently 24 million people. Now, we have an estimated total number of guns, both licit and illicit, held by civilians in Australia, totaling 3,150,000, and that was recorded in 2016. Now, our deaths resulting from firearms in 2016 totaled at only 211. Now, the law in Australia, civilians are not allowed to possess automatic and semi-automatic firearms, self-loading and pump-action shotguns, handguns with a caliber in excess of 38 inches with only narrow exemptions, semi-automatic handguns with a barrel length less than 120 millimeters, and revolvers with a barrel length less than 100 millimeters. In Australia, private possession of semi-automatic assault weapons and their lookalikes are prohibited in all but exceptional circumstances. And in Australia, civilian possession of rifles and shotguns are regulated by the law. So as you can see there, we have very, very tight gun control laws. And it limits people to a very small number of weapons, and it also limits their use. You have to actually provide a legitimate reason for having the gun. Now let's compare this to America. America's population stands at 326,766,748 people. That's a massive size. So Australia can fit into America many, many times over. Now, the current estimated total number of guns, both illicit and licit, held by civilians in the United States is estimated, and this is something that I'm going to bring up later, but all of these numbers have to be estimated because of the lack of regulation surrounding gun ownership in America. So the estimated number of guns in America currently stands between 270 million to 310 million firearms, which is a staggering amount of weapons. Again, the population is only 326 million. There are 310 weapons in America. That is nearly enough weaponry to arm every person in America. That's a scary number. Very scary number. Now, the deaths, and the closest year I could find is 2014. The current deaths stand at 33,599, and they estimate that number is going to go up when the stats come out for 2015, 16, and 17. But that's the most recent one we have. Now, if you want to know where we're getting all of these numbers and these statistics, at the end of the podcast we're going to be talking about the sources where I've collected this information, and I encourage everyone to go and check my numbers and check out those sources. You shouldn't just listen to me, or you shouldn't just listen to a pundit. You should go out and try and find this information for yourself as well. It's something that I encourage in this day and age. Now, talking about America's gun laws, Americans have the right to arm. Now, the right to private gun ownership is conditionally guaranteed by the US Constitution, known as the Second Amendment, as is limited by federal law. In the United States, civilians are not allowed to possess machine guns, sawn-off shotguns, and rifles, silencers, and armor-piercing ammunition without appropriate registration. Okay, so I want that's one of the first differences I want to talk about here. In Australia, we are not allowed to have semi-automatic weapons. They have to be very basic guns, and we have to provide a use for them. In America, you could possess machine guns, sawn-off shotguns, rifles, silencers, armor-piercing ammunition with appropriate registration. And that's a bit scary as well. So those are the sort of guns that are out there. Now, automatic weapons in the United States, private possession of fully automatic weapons is permitted subject to federal licensing. Semi-automatic assault weapons in the United States, now you have private possession of semi-automatic assault weapons is permitted without a license in almost all jurisdictions. Semi-automatic assault weapons allowed in almost all jurisdictions without a license, which is insane, absolutely insane. I don't mean to put our spin on it, but it is such a different world between Australia and America that it blows my mind when I talk about those sort of statistics. Now, moving forward from assault weapons, handguns in the United States, private possession of handguns, pistols, and revolvers is permitted without a license in almost all jurisdictions. Now, regulations for long guns in the United States, civilians' possession of rifles and shotguns is regulated by law. So that's the stats. Basically, Australians are allowed to have basic weapons as long as we prove a cause for needing them. Those weapons have to be registered, and if they're used in a crime, obviously the first person they're going to talk to is the person that registered the gun. Now, in America, you're allowed to buy your weapons, not register them. So they're basically, you can have them in your collection. You also have access to semi-automatic weapons, which we don't have in Australia. So now we're going to talk about the debate, and this comes up a lot. And the reason I wanted to put together this podcast and live stream this as well today is because often I see on Twitter, on Facebook, as well as Instagram, that people have some misconceptions about Australia, about Australian gun law. And so I thought, as an Australian, what I could do is produce this podcast, and it would help to give my American brothers and sisters the opportunity to listen to an Australian about our gun laws, so that we maybe can stop some of the misinformation out there. So one of the first debates that's often raised is we are two very different countries. Well, let me just strike this one down pretty quickly. For the most part, America and Australian culture is very, very similar. Now, we consume the same entertainment, we use the same electronics, we have access to the internet, similar cars, etc., etc. There's a bit of a misconception that most Australians live out in the never-never, out in the outback, and that's just not the case. Most of us live in cities. We have very large cities: Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Perth, Adelaide. And the differences between our cultures are actually very, very small. Other than the main difference of population, there really isn't much that is dissimilar between our two countries, which is why we've been allies for many, many years. Okay, so that's usually the biggest one, is we are two very different countries. I don't think we're two very different countries at all, really, and happy to talk about that further as well. So another debate that I see raised quite often, it's the price we pay for freedom. That's a big one, isn't it? It's the freedom, American freedom. It's something that is very prized in America. It's something that I hear a lot of Americans talking about, the price for freedom and having ultimate freedom. Well, in this case, it's a bit of a yes and no. America is a democratic nation. You vote for your leaders, and in some cases it's a little bit more democratically freeing than the Australian system. You get to actually vote for the leaders of your party, and those two parties then go into their debates, and then you can vote there, so you get to do it twice. In Australia, we vote for our local member, and then that local member is elected, and if that local member is associated with a party, the more seats that the party wins, the more that the better the chance that party will be nominated as running the government, and the Prime Minister will be selected from the leader of that party. So it's a little bit more complicated than the American system. But here's the thing. If you look at America on some general terms, it's not as free as some pundits like to talk about. Now, according to the US Bureau of Justice Statistics, 2.2 million adults were incarcerated in US federal and state prisons and country jails in 2013. So that's about 0.91% of adults, which is 1 in 110 adults in the US. Now, additionally, 4.7 million adults were on probation or parole. Now, while the United States represents about 1.4% of the world's population, it actually houses around 22% of the world's prisoners. Now, a remarkable 5.6 million Americans are forbidden to vote because of what scholars call felon disenfranchisement, referring to state laws that restrict voting rights for those convicted of serious crimes. So that's the question, isn't it? If America has, as I just said, quite a number of people in jail, and those people are refused the right to vote, for whatever the reason they're in jail, they're refused the right to vote, and that definitely strikes away at your freedom. So when we talk about it's the price we pay for freedom, it's not as free as you think it may be. And that is a very, very important idea there. And just to sort of hammer this idea home, a felon can leave prison and they can start their lives again. And they can purchase a gun which they won't have to register if they've had a non-violent act, I believe. And they'd be able to purchase and own that weapon. However, they're not allowed to vote. So that's very interesting. That's often the comment that's made. It's the price we pay for freedom. Going further from that point as well, there's often the talk about, okay, what are we going to do in case of the rise of a tyrannical government? And this is a very important one. You have to remember that even if you have a militia all armed with AR-15s, they're going to be coming against a government that is running drones, that has smart technology out there, that is very well equipped. The American army is one of the most sophisticated armies in the world. You have the highest rate of military spending. And although guerrilla tactics sometimes work in certain spaces, in certain locations, I don't necessarily think that an American militia would be able to stop a tyrannical government. And this all falls under it's the price we pay for freedom. I'm not going to make judgments on those statements, but there's something to think about when people raise that debate. Crazy though. 5.6 million Americans are forbidden to vote. So, the next topic that we face often is, it's for home security to protect my family. Now, this one is pretty subjective and it's going to be hard to measure. But one statistic I can throw out at you is that in 2014, 586 people died of unintentional gun violence. And if the firearm is always easily accessible in order for it to be an effective security option, then that also increases the danger that one of your family members is going to accidentally pick up the firearm and discharge it. Remember, 586 people in 2014 died of unintentional gun violence, and that also excludes suicides. So that's an interesting one. It's for home security. So, next argument that I'm going to tackle here, it's fun to shoot guns and I like to collect them. Now, I'm right with you on this. Shooting guns looks like a lot of fun. Shooting big guns with a ton of ammo looks really fun. But what is the cost? And that's what you have to ask yourself. Does recreation justify mass shootings? It is one of the legitimate answers that most people can actually give to me. Besides collecting guns, if you want to collect a series of guns, you have a revolver, you have a Glock, you have an AR-15, and they're all up on your wall, and you know everything about those guns, and you like to shoot them. That is a legitimate argument for having a gun. It's one of the very few arguments for having the gun. I feel that is really the only point that I can agree on. It's for home security to protect my family. It doesn't work for me. But yeah, it's fun to shoot guns. I absolutely understand why people do it. Now, the last argument that people like to present is a good guy with a gun stops a bad guy with a gun. Now, the reports go back to an idea perpetrated by the National Rifle Association, known as the NRA. Now, as the NRA's Wayne LaPerry put it in the following the mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newton, Connecticut in 2012, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is with a good guy with a gun. Basically, if more people are armed, then they can stop violence before it gets bad or prevent it altogether. Now, the fundamental problem with this argument is that mass shootings are traumatizing, terrifying events. Now, without potentially dozens or even hundreds of hours of training, most people are not going to be able to keep cool enough to get their gun out of the holster. Now, during the Texas church shootings, the good guy with a gun didn't show up until 26 people had lost their lives. We also looked at what happened with the Las Vegas shooting. That was in heavy Republican country. It was a country western musical performance, a concert, and you would think that a lot of those people would have guns. And some of the reports were that yes, people did have guns on the day, but they were afraid to pull out their firearms because they were afraid the police would mistake them for the shooter. So again, this argument to me seems to be once again a bit null and void. So that's the standard debate around gun control. Those are some of the phrases that I often see on Twitter that often get leveled towards Australia. And so that's my opinion on those. And that leads me to the next question. Can Australian gun laws work in the US? Now, with over 300 million guns floating around in the US, I would say that the genie is well and truly out of the bottle. However, in my personal opinion, I think that there is a way to start reducing some of the violence, and that's by the outright banning of the shooter's best friend. That's the AR-15. Now, the AR-15 is a semi-automatic weapon. The magazine can hold 20 to 30 rounds, and the firing rate can be pushed up using a bump stock. Now, very interesting, at the day of this recording, bump stocks have now been banned by the Trump administration, which is, it's good to see. This is the first positive move towards gun control that I've seen in America. Now, the ability to fire 30 bullets and reload quickly and fire again is what is making these massacres so devastating. With the Florida school shooting and the Las Vegas massacre being clear examples of the devastation wrought by this weapon, going forward is the need to eliminate all semi-automatic guns, and I include the Bushmaster XM15 in that as well. That was used at the Sandy Hook massacre. So, one of the things that we did in Australia is we had the buyback scheme, and what happened is that if you'd purchased a gun, you were able to hand it into the government, and they were able to hand you some money, some compensation, so that you didn't lose money. And that is the question of whether America could afford it or not. If you have, 300 million guns out there, how is the American government going to be able to afford to buy back those weapons? Would they even be surrendered? I think in the current climate, especially with the teenagers from Florida protesting, there seems to be a little bit of ramp up in gun control that I don't think America has ever seen before. So I think there may be some people out there who are maybe a little bit more likely to hand in their weapons. And being compensated for that, I think, is a great incentive. But there are a lot of guns out there. So I think what they need to do is start looking at gun amnesties or gun buyback schemes for some of the semi-automatics. Take a look at some of the combat shotguns. Take a look at some of the AR-15 assault rifles. Can they start bringing those back in? And can they start to maybe offer some compensation for the people who voluntarily hand over their rifles? Now, another thing that has to be mentioned, of course, is that the NRA is an organization, it's a lobby group in America, that has its fingers in all the pies. A lot of the politicians, including Donald Trump. Donald Trump was paid $30 million in campaign money, 24 directly, and then I believe the next couple of million helped to fill out some of the advertising budget for them to get Donald Trump elected. And what that means is that political opinion is currently being swayed by money. Now, as I mentioned before, there are over 300 million people in America, and I believe that a lot of those people actually have a real interest in gun control laws and stopping these mass shootings, especially considering that a lot of these mass shootings involve children. We're talking about teenagers, Sandy Hook, we're talking about toddlers and young children. And so the motivation, I think, in America has never been stronger than it has before. So what you need to do to be able to convince these senators, who get paid quite an exceptional amount of money, and it's not paid to them directly in the most part. What it happens is it's given to them in their campaign funds, and they're able to spend it on advertising. I'm not going to go into the American political system here, but that means that the NRA does have their ears. But the way that people, believe it or not, can motivate change, if you do it in big enough groups, if you form large marches, you can actually show people that there is a difference. And remember, these are children that you have to stand up for, that you have to offer some protections for, because they need to see guidance. They need to see adults taking the lead. It's both it's a very positive thing to see American teenagers standing up for their beliefs, going to their local governments, having protests in front of the White House. But it'd also be great to see a lot more people around these children supporting them and offering them a bit of a brighter future. Now, the NRA is essentially owned by the gun manufacturers. The gun manufacturers are the ones that mass marketed the AR-15. You can even get the AR-15 in pink for all you lady hunters out there. So this is the problem. Is if the AR-15 is just for recreational purposes, or if it's for home protection, they market it in pink, and that's something that you guys need to think about as well. With the NRA essentially being the lobbyist wing of the gun manufacturers. Are they more interested in good shares and getting those dividends out to their shareholders, or are they interested in protecting you? Now, that's a question that you really need to think about very strongly. So yeah, I think that for America to move forward, what you need to do is actually have a look at some of the weapons that are available on the market, and going forward, see which ones are most used for recreation. There are a lot of guns out there that are slow firing, that need a lot of skill in order to be a good hunter. And I think that those guns, at the very least, pose less of a risk to mass shooters that the AR-15 does. So, how do we conclude this one? Since the Port Arthur massacre in Australia, we've been nearly free of gun violence. Now, there will always be gun violence, just as there will always be criminality. But the difference is in the numbers. In 2017, the US had 346 mass shootings. That's nearly one shooting for every day of the year. And sadly, I think you'll continue to see these shooting massacres until gun regulation is brought in. Since 1996, Australia has had 0 gun massacres. And that's something that is very, very important. There were massacres before 1996. There were no massacres after 1996. It does work. It can be very effective. It's just a matter of not taking gun control as a personal attack, and instead seeing that in all things that there should be regulation. If you go to a theme park, the roller coaster that you'll enjoy your day on, that you'll get to ride, that roller coaster has more regulation than guns. Isn't that interesting? To drive a car, you need to be licensed. You need to be licensed to drive a car. You need, in Australia, to register your pet, so that you can be accountable for your pet if they go running amok or if they get lost. And that's the big difference here. We're talking about regulation. So that's really all we're going to talk about on this podcast. Hopefully I've managed to tackle some of the debates around gun control. And hopefully I've given you a bit of an idea of what Australian gun laws are like and what life is like in Australia. Now, if you'd like to check us out on social media, you can head over to the Modern Meltdown's Facebook page. Just type in Modern Meltdown into the search bar. We're also on Twitter. Our handle is @ModernMeltdown, and you can find us on Instagram. Our home on the web is themodernmeltdown.com. Now, we also have a couple of other podcasts on the Modern Meltdown network, and that's the TV Breakdown. Every week, myself, Tommy Din, and Lindsay Soul discuss everything there is to know about TV. We like to review television shows. At the moment, we're currently looking at Waco, which I'd highly recommend, and has a little bit to do with today's podcast. Our other podcaster, Holly Hunt, produces Beyond the Words, which is a wonderful instructional tool. It has interviews from authors, all offering tips and tricks on how to write your best-selling novel. So I'd like to thank you very much, and that's the